Maya Chen had spent 10 years trying to forget the combat missions, the hot extractions, and the soldiers she'd pulled from battlefields across Afghanistan. Until a training exercise went catastrophically wrong in her airspace, and she became the only pilot within 100 miles who could execute a rescue under fire. Welcome to Daily Story. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of aviation expertise and life-saving courage, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button to join our community. The Colorado Rocky Mountains presented some of the most challenging helicopter flying conditions in North America, where sudden weather changes, high-altitude operations, and treacherous terrain tested even the most experienced pilots. Medical helicopter operations in this environment required not just technical flying skills but the kind of judgment that could mean the difference between saving lives and becoming another mountain rescue statistic. LifeFlight Colorado operated a fleet of 12 medical helicopters serving the mountain communities and ski resorts scattered across 50,000 square miles of some of America's most rugged terrain. Their pilots flew missions that ranged from routine hospital transfers to emergency rescues in conditions that would ground most civilian aircraft. Captain Maya Chen had been LifeFlight's senior pilot for 10 years, flying a Eurocopter EC-135 equipped for high-altitude medical operations. At 42, she had logged over 8,000 flight hours in mountain operations, more than any other civilian helicopter pilot in the state. She could land on mountain ridges with barely enough space for her skis, navigate through passes when visibility dropped to zero, and execute precision approaches to accident scenes where any error would be fatal. Her colleagues knew her as the pilot who never refused a mission, who could fly in weather that kept other helicopters grounded, and who somehow always brought her patients home alive. She spoke with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to life and death decisions, used aviation terminology that seemed more military than civilian, and could calculate complex flight physics in her head while managing emergency medical operations. Doctors and paramedics trusted Maya completely. When she said she could make the flight, they knew their patient would reach the hospital. When she said conditions were too dangerous, they knew that attempting the mission would be suicide. Her judgment was absolute, her flying was flawless, and her dedication to saving lives was unwavering. Maya lived in a small house in the mountain town of Vail, where she could see the peaks she flew among every day. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet woman who left for work before dawn and often returned after dark, always wearing her flight suit, always ready for the next emergency call. What Maya's colleagues didn't know, what LifeFlight's management couldn't have suspected from her employment history, was that Chief Warrant Officer for Maya Chen, United States Army, had spent 15 years as one of the most elite combat helicopter pilots in American military history. She had flown UH-60 Black Hawks during some of the most intense combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, executing hot extractions under enemy fire, conducting special operations insertions in hostile territory, and performing rescue missions that had saved hundreds of soldiers' lives under conditions that had killed other pilots. Her military aviation career included over 2,000 combat flight hours, 3 distinguished flying crosses, and classified missions that took her into airspace where American helicopters weren't supposed to operate. She had been shot down twice, had landed helicopters with critical damage that shouldn't have been flyable, and had executed rescues under fire that became case studies in Army aviation schools. The transition from combat aviation to civilian medical helicopter operations had been part of a carefully planned psychological recovery. After 15 years of flying missions where enemy fire was expected and every flight could end in death, Maya had requested assignment to work that used her aviation skills to save lives without the constant presence of combat. Her house contained memorabilia from her military career that she kept in a locked room, photographs of aircraft she had flown, commendations for missions she couldn't discuss openly, and flight charts from operations in countries where American military presence was never officially acknowledged. Her bookshelf held technical manuals on helicopter combat tactics, survival procedures, and aviation medicine that represented 15 years of mastering one of the most dangerous professions in military service. Maya had found peace in work that saved lives through precision flying rather than combat operations. Each day brought challenges that required the same aviation expertise she had developed during 15 years of military service, but her patients were injured civilians rather than wounded soldiers, and the threats she faced came from weather and terrain rather than enemy fire. The morning of October 23 started with routine mountain operations, a ski patrol evacuation from Breckenridge, a cardiac patient transfer from Aspen, and the usual collection of calls that defined autumn in Colorado's high country. Maya was returning from the cardiac transfer when she noticed unusual military helicopter activity in the training area north of Vail. Army helicopters regularly conducted mountain warfare training in the Colorado Rockies, using the high-altitude environment to prepare crews for operations in Afghanistan and other mountainous regions. Maya had observed hundreds of training exercises during her 10 years with LifeFlight, always maintaining professional distance from military aviation that reminded her of the career she had left behind. At 2:17 p.m., Maya's radio activated with an emergency call that would change everything. Life Flight 7, this is Peterson Air Force Base Emergency Operations. We have a military helicopter down with multiple casualties in the training area northwest of Vale. All available medical helicopters are requested to respond. Maya immediately understood the severity of the situation. A downed military helicopter in mountain terrain meant casualties, potential survivors trapped in wreckage, and the kind of rescue operation that required both medical evacuation capabilities and combat aviation expertise. Peterson Operations, Life Flight 7 responding. Request specific location and nature of emergency. Life Flight 7, be advised this is an Army Black Hawk conducting mountain warfare training. The aircraft experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure and crashed in remote terrain at approximately 12,000 feet elevation. 12 personnel aboard, casualties unknown, crash site is in an active training area. Maya felt her blood run cold. A Black Hawk crash with 12 people aboard meant multiple critical injuries, and the 12,000-foot elevation meant that rescue operations would be at the absolute limits of helicopter performance. Worse, active training area meant the crash had occurred during live-fire exercises where explosive ordnance might still be present. Peterson Operations, what's the status of military rescue assets? Life Flight 7, nearest Army medevac helicopters are responding from Fort Carson, ETA 90 minutes. Local search and rescue is responding, but estimates 2 hours to reach the crash site on foot due to terrain. Maya calculated the situation with expertise developed during 15 years of combat aviation. 90 minutes was too long if there were critically injured survivors who needed immediate medical attention. 2 hours was definitely too long. But flying a civilian medical helicopter into an active military training area where explosives might be present violated every safety protocol. Peterson Operations, Life Flight 7 can reach the crash site in approximately 12 minutes. Request authorization to respond. There was a pause before Peterson responded. Life Flight 7, crash site is in an active training area with potential unexploded ordnance. You're not authorized for operations in that environment. Maya made a decision based on 15 years of combat aviation and 10 years of mountain rescue experience. Peterson Operations, I'm responding to the crash site. I'll accept responsibility for operating in the training area. Life Flight 7, negative. Military rescue assets are en route. Maintain position outside the training area. Maya switched her radio to the emergency frequency used for military aviation and transmitted a message she had hoped never to use again. Peterson Operations, this is Chief Warrant Officer 4 Maya Chen, former 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Authentication code Chen Charlie Whiskey Oscar 4 Alpha Bravo. I am responding to the Black Hawk crash site using the Military Aviation Authority. The authentication code was one Maya hadn't used in 10 years. Her classified military aviation identifier that would pull up her complete service record, including combat missions and special operations certifications. Within 3 minutes, her radio activated with a new voice. Chief Chen, this is Colonel Marcus Thompson, Fort Carson Aviation Brigade. Your service record has been verified. You are authorized to respond to the crash site using any procedures you deem necessary. Be advised this is an extremely high-risk operation in an active ordnance area. Copy that, Colonel. Life Flight 7 proceeding to the crash site. Maya immediately adjusted her flight path and began an approach to the mountain area where the Black Hawk had gone down. Her civilian medical helicopter wasn't designed for operations in military training areas, but her combat aviation experience told her exactly how to minimize risks while maximizing response speed. As she approached the crash site, Maya could see the downed Black Hawk on a steep mountainside at 12,000 feet, an altitude where her EC-135's performance would be severely degraded by thin air and where any mistake would be fatal. The helicopter had impacted hard, but the fuselage appeared mostly intact, suggesting there might be survivors. Maya executed an approach that drew immediate attention from military personnel monitoring the emergency. Instead of using standard medical helicopter procedures, she was flying combat insertion patterns designed to minimize exposure time in hostile environments. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, commanding officer of the training exercise, watched Maya's approach through binoculars and immediately recognized techniques she had only seen during Special Operations Aviation training. Captain, that's not standard medical helicopter flying. She's using 160th SOAR insertion procedures. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers, represented the absolute elite of Army helicopter aviation, conducting the most dangerous missions in the most hostile environments anywhere in the world. Maya brought her medical helicopter to a precise hover just above the crash site, assessing the scene with combat-trained eyes. The Black Hawk had crashed on a slope too steep for normal landing, surrounded by boulders that made traditional rescue approaches impossible. She would have to maintain a hover at 12,000 feet, at the edge of her helicopter's performance envelope, while her medical crew rappelled down to treat casualties. Peterson Operations, Life Flight 7 is on scene. I'm establishing a hover position for medical crew deployment. The crash site is extremely hazardous with steep terrain and potential ordnance. I'm seeing movement in the wreckage, indicating survivors. Maya held her EC-135 in rocksteady hover, while her two-person medical crew rappelled 40 feet to the crash site. Maintaining hover at 12,000 feet in mountain winds required every bit of her 8,000 hours of helicopter experience, but it was the combat aviation training that allowed her to do it while simultaneously directing rescue operations and assessing tactical risks. For the next 25 minutes, Maya held position in conditions that would have defeated most helicopter pilots. The thin air at 12,000 feet meant her engine was producing barely enough power to maintain hover, mountain winds buffeted her aircraft with gusts that required constant corrections, and the knowledge that unexploded training ordnance might be scattered around the crash site added psychological pressure that could break concentration. Her medical crew worked frantically to stabilize casualties, while Maya coordinated with military rescue teams that were still 60 minutes away. Through her cockpit window, she could see that several soldiers had been thrown from the Black Hawk during impact and were scattered across the mountainside in positions that would require multiple rescue flights. Peterson Operations, Life Flight 7. Medical crew reports 12 personnel accounted for, 8 critical injuries requiring immediate evacuation, and 4 with serious but stable injuries. I can extract 2 critical patients per flight. Request additional medical helicopters expedite to this location. Life Flight 7, Army medevac helicopters are 40 minutes out. Civilian mountain rescue helicopters are responding, but none have high-altitude hover capability for this terrain. Maya made a decision that would require her to execute the most demanding helicopter operations of her career, multiple high-altitude hover extractions in deteriorating weather conditions with critically injured patients whose survival depended on speed and precision. Peterson Operations, I'm executing multiple extraction flights. First 2 critical patients are being prepared for hoist now. Over the next hour and a half, Maya executed 6 separate extraction flights from the crash site, each one requiring her to return to 12,000-foot hover in conditions that were getting progressively worse as afternoon weather moved into the mountains. She extracted all 8 critical patients before Army medevac helicopters arrived, delivering them to trauma centers that could provide the advanced medical care they needed. When the last patient had been delivered and Maya finally landed her helicopter at the Vail Life Flight Base, she found Colonel Thompson and Lieutenant Colonel Martinez waiting with a contingent of Army aviation personnel. Chief Chen, I need to understand what I just witnessed, Colonel Thompson said. You executed 6 high-altitude hover extractions in conditions that would have challenged our most experienced combat pilots. Where did you develop those capabilities? Maya secured her helicopter before responding, her hands finally showing the slight tremor that came from 90 minutes of maximum stress flying. Colonel, I flew Black Hawks with the 160th for 15 years. 12 years in Afghanistan, 3 in Iraq, multiple deployments to other locations I can't discuss. Chief, those weren't just Black Hawk procedures. You were flying special operations insertion and extraction patterns that are classified for SOAR pilots. Sir, I was with SOAR from 2003 to 2018. I flew everything from standard combat assault to classified direct action missions. When I retired, I wanted to use my aviation skills to save lives in a different way. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez pulled up Maya's military service record on a secure tablet. Chief, your record shows over 2,000 combat flight hours, 3 DFCs, and participation in operations that are still classified. Why are you flying medical helicopters in Colorado? Maya looked across the tarmac at her EC-135, which had just completed the most demanding day of civilian flying in its operational history. Ma'am, I spent 15 years pulling soldiers out of combat zones. I wanted to spend the next part of my career pulling civilians out of mountains. Same mission, different uniform. Chief, the Army needs pilots with your capabilities. The incident today demonstrated that civilian helicopter operations can intersect with military emergencies in ways that require combat aviation expertise. Would you consider a consulting position? Maya considered the offer while watching the sunset over the same mountains she had flown through all day. She had spent 10 years building a civilian aviation career that allowed her to save lives without the constant stress of combat operations. But today had demonstrated that her combat aviation expertise could bridge military and civilian worlds in ways that could save lives when conventional systems failed. I'll consult on high-risk medical evacuation procedures and mountain combat aviation, but I want to maintain my position with Lifeflight. This community depends on medical helicopter service, and I've found purpose in serving civilians rather than conducting military operations. 6 months later, Captain Maya Chen was still flying medical evacuations for Lifeflight Colorado, but now her helicopter was equipped with enhanced high-altitude capability and her training expertise was being used to develop new procedures for civilian-military emergency response coordination. She had established training programs where civilian medical helicopter pilots learned advanced high-altitude techniques, while Army aviators studied mountain rescue procedures that could be adapted for combat operations. Her emergency response protocols had been adopted across multiple states, creating coordination procedures that improved outcomes when civilian and military aviation resources needed to work together. The medical helicopter pilot who civilians knew as their reliable mountain rescue aviator was also the combat veteran who had ensured that Army helicopter crews could be saved when training exercises went wrong in the unforgiving terrain of the Colorado Rockies. Maya had learned that retiring from combat aviation didn't mean abandoning military expertise. It meant finding ways to use that knowledge to save lives in both civilian and military contexts while maintaining the peaceful career she had built among the mountains she loved. Her work had revealed something important. Some of the most valuable military capabilities resided not in active duty personnel, but in veterans who had chosen civilian careers while maintaining skills that could bridge worlds and save lives when emergencies required expertise that existed in very few pilots. The helicopter pilot who flew injured skiers to hospitals was also the combat aviator who could execute rescues that combined medical evacuation with special operations aviation techniques, creating capabilities that neither civilian nor military systems could provide alone. Sometimes the most important military skills are preserved by people who choose peaceful careers but remain ready to deploy expertise when missions require capabilities that take decades to develop and can't be quickly replicated. Maya Chen had discovered that true aviation service meant using flying skills to save lives wherever they were needed, whether extracting soldiers from battlefields or rescuing climbers from mountains, and that the most effective emergency response often required people who understood both military and civilian aviation at the highest levels. The mountains that she flew through every day were protected by her civilian dedication, but when military emergencies occurred in her airspace, those same mountains were navigated by combat aviation expertise that had been refined through 15 years of flying the most dangerous missions in the most hostile environments. So now I ask you, have you ever known a helicopter pilot, aviator, or emergency responder whose capabilities seemed to exceed what their job required? Someone who handled extreme situations with composure that suggested much more demanding previous experience? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the hidden aviation experts, the combat veterans who chose civilian service, the people who bring specialized skills to ordinary jobs while remaining ready to deploy extraordinary capabilities when emergencies reveal the need for expertise that exists in very few people. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that protection often comes from people working in unexpected roles while maintaining capabilities from careers that pushed human limits, hit that subscribe button and join the Daily Story community. We're here to honor the helicopter pilots, the combat aviators, the people who dedicate their lives to saving others through flying skills that most of us can only imagine, serving communities through work that appears routine but contains depths of expertise that become visible only when circumstances demand capabilities that define the difference between rescue and tragedy. Thank you for watching, and remember, the next time you see a medical helicopter, hear a rescue operation overhead, or encounter an aviation professional who demonstrates unusual skill, look a little closer. You might be witnessing someone who has spent decades mastering one of humanity's most demanding professions, now serving civilians through work that honors both their military past and their commitment to saving lives in whatever form that service takes.